Welcome to today's broadcast of North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of NIC television students, and your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
On this program, one of our very favorite topics is world travel, and from time to time we're fortunate to have people come and visit with us that can share their travels around the world. We have two returning guests we've had a number of times over the years, and I always invite them back when they have been traveling around the world because they are so excellent at describing not only the areas they've gone to, but the political, social, and economic aspects of the people of that part of the world. I welcome to the program two leaders of our business and civic community in Kootenai County, Stephen and Judith Meyer, who have been in our county and working for many, many years, as I've indicated on this program. They recently went to Australia, New Zealand, and New Guinea, and we're going to do a two-part series. On the first program, we're going to talk mostly about Australia and New Zealand, and then next week we'll talk about New Guinea. As always, it's a pleasure to have you here, and we welcome both of our friends to the program.
Thank you, Tony.
And as always, I'm happy to have regular panelist, Idaho State Senator Mary Lou Reed, and she will commence today's questioning.
Thank you, Tony, and welcome to two of the world's most observant travelers. It's always fun to talk to you about your travels. Judy, why don't you start out with telling us and our viewers where you went this time and why you went there.
All righty, Lou. We started out here in Idaho and were tempted with some free airplane tickets we had that led us into traveling quite a long ways, further than we originally expected. But we planned then to travel from Idaho, cross the equator, down to New Zealand. We were just in the North Island of New Zealand. South Island of New Zealand, sorry, North Island. And from there flew on over to Australia to the Sydney area, spent a little bit of time in the Sydney area, and then north up to Cairns. And it's about 1,000 miles north from Sydney to Cairns. And so we really, although we were traveling in June and starting out in the wintertime in New Zealand, ending up in the prime time to travel on the Great Barrier Reef when the water is cool but not as hospitable to sharks and jellyfish. So that's when we wanted to be in the Great Barrier Reef. That's off the coast of Cairns. It's one of the best places to travel. The Great Barrier Reef runs the entire coast. We were in the Cairns area.
Well, let's talk about the Great Barrier Reef because I'm dying to know a little bit more about what you did there. You went snorkeling.
Yes, we were proverbial tourists, and really that's the only way we knew how to travel to the reef is, in fact, sign up for a day trip and have an expedition leader take a whole crowd of folk out to the Barrier Reef. This expedition organization has a platform, a large platform. How big would you guess?
40 or 50 feet square floating platform that they go out to on a big boat, maybe 200 people.
And that's your launching point for the day.
And that's your launching point for the day. It's an all-day activity, and they provide snorkeling equipment and a little submersible miniature submarine, I guess is the best way to describe it, that you can go and look at a larger area than you can paddle around swimming. And then we started off doing that.
We'd also arranged to use a naturalist to give us, in a group of no more than 10, an individual snorkeling tour for about an hour where you are equipped and follow the naturalist out, and she speaks to you about what you're going to see, and then you all dip down and take a look at what it is. She's very careful about explaining the fragility of the reef and the fact that we are not to touch or in any way impact the reef, at least physically by touching it. So she said, I will go down and find the sea cucumber and bring it up to you, and I will hold it and we will talk about it. Then she very diligently returns to the very same spot the sea cucumber came from and tucks it back in again.
Well, I understand the Great Barrier Reef is the oldest ecological system in the entire universe or in the entire world. And will one of you talk about the formation and the scope and what's the significance of the Great Barrier Reef? It isn't really just sitting there for people to go out and snorkel and enjoy. It has a history and importance.
One of the interesting statements we heard when we were there, Lou, was that the Great Barrier Reef is the largest living structure in the world and the only one, I guess the largest one, that you can see from outer space. And the astronauts can see the Great Barrier Reef with regular eyes from the moon or from orbiting around the Earth. It's made up of tiny little creatures who secrete materials which wind up like limestone. And so it's a living thing that these creatures die and leave behind literally a little empty shell. And I should say shell, it's not like a shellfish. And it winds up in all different sorts of shapes and colors and forms. And you think of coral, and coral comes in literally thousands of forms. There's some that are spiny, like antlers. There's one that's called a brain coral, which looks just like photographs of a brain with little ridges and furrows in it. There are others that look like big, wide, flat mushrooms. All kinds of structures. The barrier reef occurs, it's called a barrier reef because it's literally a barrier between the deep water and the shoreline of the eastern side of Australia. It only occurs in a very narrow temperature range, so that it happens in Australia because the depth of the sea is shallow, less than 20 feet, and it's protected, or there's not very much severe wave action, so the outer part of the reef protects the inner part of the reef, and then it becomes a wonderful habitat for the fish. And
Fish heaven.
The fish heaven, and it's just like watching Jacques Cousteau on public TV. All these colored fish are just everywhere, and there's big ones and little ones and striped ones, and we saw some 5 or 6 foot long fish, big fish, I mean, for human scale.
Especially when you're in the water next to them.
Yeah, and big schools of them, and our guide would point out something, and then she would swim along carefully, and you could get almost close enough to touch. It's a different kind of a guided tour experience in that you can't talk to the guide and ask questions because you're underwater. And so everybody comes back up to the surface, and then there's half a dozen questions and some agreement on where you go next, and then down you go again and swim along, and the guide will point to things. In this case, it was a gal, and then come back up and explain.
And I was thinking about the fragility of it, Lou. I was impressed with Australia's education of the community and the public as we visit it, that it is fragile. And the balance of the water quality that it takes to sustain the life, and the fragility of the tide cannot be out very long. If the sun shines directly on the reef, it will in fact scorch, sunburn the various plants that live there, plants and animals that live there. And so she demonstrated it in her naturalist tour of being delicate and sensitive to it. And the posters and just the public education was good. It's still a dilemma. Taking people out to show it off is going to impact it, and yet if we don't educate and have people see it and treasure it, will it get the attention it needs?
I always like to pursue with both of you some of the things that are going on in the countries you visit, such as I indicated at the beginning of the program, the economic status and what's going on politically. Would you both take some time to share with us in both those two countries, of New Zealand and Australia, what is happening economically at this time, and what trends are happening economically in both countries?
The Australia in particular is going through some traumatic times with a struggle with inflation and rising interest rates, and the local television programs and the newspaper headlines were filled with stories of frustration about rapidly rising interest rates, particularly the hardships brought about by escalating home mortgage rates. And we talked to people who had mortgage payments up in the 20%, or interest rates up in the 20% range.
Well, it's variable. My seatmate on the plane, a woman who was going to see her daughter, the woman was from New Zealand, and the family was originally from New Zealand. And they struggle with the exodus of folks from New Zealand to Australia. That's the land of boom and opportunity. And she reported that her daughter's interest rate varied from month to month for the payments on her home, and it had gone from 17% to 22% for next month's interest rate percentage. And the family was reeling with trying, and both parents are working, trying to meet those payments. And how do you budget ahead when that variable can change month to month?
One of the causes in Australia of this interest rate stability problem is a balance of payments problem, Tony, brought about by the difference between exports and imports. We saw a TV program where they were editorializing about this challenge, and to illustrate the problem, the producer gave two ladies $250 to go shopping, and they could buy anything they wanted, and it was a big multi-purpose department store-like thing, had groceries and soft goods. And so these women who had children bought toys and children's clothes and some food items.
Groceries.
And, you know, just a big heaping basket full of $250 worth of whatever they wanted. And then the producer of the TV program inventoried the contents of the baskets as to country of origin. And it was remarkable. $240-some worth of the goods came from outside of Australia, and $7 or $8 were made in Australia. And the point was, and there's some national political effort to try to educate the people that we simply have to buy locally made goods. And our appetite for clothes, and of course the clothes come from Taiwan and Hong Kong and
the electronics
Malaysia,
products.
and the electronics products from Taiwan and Japan. The automobiles are almost all imported. The only thing that's commonly used that's locally made are food items and some manufactured goods. Now Australia is a relatively sophisticated manufacturing kind of environment, very much like the United States. The point that was made was that the people's appetites for goods and services is primarily met, or is better met, by imported goods. And it's a real challenging situation for them.
Do you have the same situation in New Zealand, or is the economy more stable?
No, I sensed, and again, my inventory was the folks we visited with in the tourist industry, because that's how we were traveling. We talked to motel owners and tourist service people. A similar dilemma, and in fact the same exodus to leave New Zealand and go where there might be more chance at earning money, more employment opportunities. New Zealand is much more agricultural feeling and rural, and we're just in the southern island, which is much of a dairy product and sheep growing area. And most of the kids that grow up don't want to stay there tending the cows and the sheep. We thought it felt kind of like a northern Idaho phenomenon. It's why stay in New Zealand?
Yeah. Tough employment problem.
Well, is there an identity problem, or are we talking about when you're saying that the goods that are appealing to them are coming from someplace else? They're seeing them on American television or on Japanese television or whatever it may be. Why can they not adapt their manufacturing products, et cetera, to be appropriate? Do they need to sell themselves on themselves?
Well, I think the whole wage issue, to pay the wages that are needed in Australia, from what we heard and saw.
Terrible struggle. That's a long-term process, Lou, and just like in this country, we have only Zenith remains as an American domestic television producer, and no VCRs, for example, are made in this country. Never have been any.
So it's price rather than image.
It's price and quality.
And the cost of manufacture.
And style, and all those things which motivate us. The people in Australia are very much like us, as they are in New Zealand. I was standing on a corner at an Esso station. There are still Esso stations in Australia. Gasoline station. We were buying gas. And I looked down the street, and I was struck that I could be anywhere of a number of places in the United States. I mean, the buildings and the traffic and the landscaping, and it's just very, very what we would call Western, very American in character. New Zealand is less so. New Zealand, someone said, is like the United States was 40 years ago. And I think that best describes what we experienced. It's an agricultural country, beautiful green rolling hills, 4 or 5 million people, and 75 million sheep. It's just an enormous.
Not to mention a few kangaroos here.
Not in New Zealand,
yeah.
but in the Kiwifruit are probably the major new growth industry for New Zealand. We toured a kiwi plant, orchard, and packing house, and I was quite intrigued with how much they've changed. Even the name of the kiwi was, I forgot what it was now, but it was marketing.
Some kind of a pear. It had a name like prickly pear, only that's not the right one, but kiwi was an adapted name for the fruit, but very successful activity.
You mentioned earlier the Japanese investment. Was this true in both Australia and New Zealand, that Steve, or Judy, where you felt that there was concern among the local inhabitants about the fact that so much property and industries were being purchased by outside investors, primarily Japanese?
That was an acute local issue in Cairns in Australia. That Cairns is a town of 40 or 50,000, perhaps a little bigger than Coeur d'Alene. Similar latitude to the Hawaiian Islands here. Very popular tourist destination for all the Pacific Rim countries. as well as Australians in Sydney and Melbourne, the biggest cities. Cairns is farther north than it is from Miami to Montreal. And so in the wintertime in the urban areas in Australia, like Cairns is a wonderful vacation spot.
We were there in June, so we're there on the shortest day of the year in Australia, having left the longest day here, thinking, why'd we do this? And so Cairns up here in the north is a recreation area and appealing to investors.
And the result is that it's a very popular, very rapidly growing tourist area, and lots of new investment there. The biggest, most elegant hotel I've ever seen anywhere in the world was a place just north of Cairns at Port Douglas called the Sheraton Mirage, which was an extravagant hotel, fancier than anything I've seen in Hawaii. The elegant properties are being bought as fast as they are developed by Australians by Japanese interests. And there's a lot of concern amongst the people on the street about our town being bought by the Japanese. You know, some people will say by foreigners, and it's very discomforting for them. And I understand it would be scary. All of the valuable speculative parcels are bought by Japanese investors. The fancy hotels are filled with Japanese guests. And so I'm sure there's a distinct feeling amongst the natives that our town is changing and we don't like it.
Dealing with cultural values and social habits and behavior, I'm always intrigued when one travels to another part of the world, the comparison and contrast with our own cultural values. You've been many places before that we've talked about. Now after this trip, what struck you in particular as so different in how people look at life in both New Zealand and Australia?
I think about those things too as I travel, Tony, and I would say one of the things our family came home with, because we were traveling with our 2 teenage sons, was no matter where you go in the world, there are very much the same dilemmas of life. And in developing countries, it's how fast to develop. In Australia and New Zealand, which are reasonably well developed as we would perceive well developed to be, the social issue of women's rights, women's health issues, the dilemma of what to do with the original folk. In New Zealand, it was the Maori Indian group from the Polynesian area. In Australia, it's the Aborigines. Neither of those folk have a written language. The whole history of those people has been kind of, for a long time, denied or ignored. I was pleased to see in Australia a real effort to begin to recognize and treasure some of the arts and crafts. The Aboriginal art is now much more popular and now has some economic value, which does in fact help the Aborigines, who many have chosen not to enter into the life of the city, but to go stay on the land, the outback area. The Aborigines who come into town usually have a difficult way. Alcoholism is a dilemma. Unemployment amongst the Aborigines is highest of all. So probably we would say to your question, there are not that many differences, it seemed to us, as how do you maintain a delicate balance in the environment and the natural resources of people, as well as flora and fauna, is troublesome and challenging everywhere.
I wondered if you might have gotten some information. I recall from your comments that we had a really wonderful person on this program some years ago from New Zealand, from the Maori tribe, and she indicated the struggle they were having at that time, in particular the role of women within her tribe, and also the whole issue of how the government reacted to their needs. Did you get any additional information?
A little bit of that. Again, traveling gives you time to visit with folks on planes, and generally our family spreads apart. We've had enough of each other while we're traveling. It's good to visit with someone else. And in visiting with a couple of the different people I did, there was a general feeling that the government is struggling with the issue and that they're identifying it as an issue and not ignoring it. But the solution is very difficult. Whose land is it now? The Maori were there first. They'd like to have it back. If you don't have it back, how do you establish a value for it to pay for it? Fishing rights. I thought, gee, here I am in the Northwest again. The development of land. Should the hotel and high-rises be along the shoreline, in fact, bought by foreign investors, or should that land be protected in its original state? The Prime Minister of New Zealand now is of the Maori extraction. So there's a feeling that this now has given affirmation and credibility to these folks. They're real, they're going to be felt in the administration of the government.
Reef.
Well, Judy, you're always especially interested in women's issues. And why don't you talk a little bit more about New Zealand? And you mentioned earlier that New Zealand the women were given the vote at a very early time. Could you see the evidence of the impact of women's voting upon the programs?
For what little we could tell, and we have to be careful, Lou, we visited there just a few days, if you really measure it that way, for time to visit with people and so on. It was a very comfortable place for me to be because I care about women's issues, and I was feeling that those issues were easily discussed and readily available for pondering, and again, no real clear solutions. I'm excited by the fact that in New Zealand the women have had a key role in voting to choose not to have nuclear weapons or vessels with nuclear weapons allowed into their country, to their seaports or landing in their land. And it was a woman in the New Zealand government who brought that issue about and caused the vote to go that direction. And in fact, as we tested that idea on New Zealanders, how do you feel about your country not accepting nuclear weapons? I was, again, pleased and excited that there was a general feeling of that's okay. And it really came into focus for me when we said, well, we feel kind of awkward as Americans because I know that's been a tussle between our government and yours. And one of the New Zealanders looked at us and said, well, Great Britain doesn't think much of our policy either. Oh yes, that means their homeland is their mother nation that they have been separate from for a long time, but still originally started out primarily from northern Great Britain. And so there are fourth generation New Zealanders that I was visiting with who feel that we're New Zealanders, we're not any part of the Commonwealth. And so still to deny the access for nuclear weapons from their own founding mother country was a new perspective I hadn't had.
The anti-nuclear weapon or nuclear arms issue in New Zealand is not controversial in New Zealand.
That's right. They're quite comfortable with their policy.
They are
made
absolutely
their choice.
comfortable, and us Americans can just, scram. That they are not intimidated by the lack of American military resource, for example, available to them. They simply don't want nuclear-powered ships or nuclear weapons on our ships or on ships from any country in New Zealand. And we talked to some very conservative, politically conservative people that felt the same way. I mean, it is just not a controversial issue. While we were in New Zealand, the papers had stories of their prime minister being in the United States, who was not invited to visit with the Reagan administration.
Cool, very cool.
Very cool.
Connections.
Would have been Bush administration.
Bush, that's
Yep,
right. Bush had just been inaugurated because of this nuclear weapons issue, and so the prime minister spoke at Yale and went to Washington and I guess stayed in the Holiday Inn and left town. It's an interesting break with classical Western political relationships, but not controversial in New Zealand.
How about immigration policies? I know that there have been people who've gone from the Northern Hemisphere to New Zealand because of their concerns over the potential nuclear disasters. Did you pick up anything about how welcome people are as immigrants? And did you happen to run across anyone?
Not particularly, Lou. I think our sense of the dilemma of employment was we're struggling with employing the people we have living here now. It will be hard to be very eager to have more folks coming.
So the doors would not be wide open.
The doors are not open. They are interested in people with technical skills that they don't have present now, but you have to have a work permit to get into New Zealand or Australia, and you have to have a skill which the government has classified as one that's in demand. Very difficult unemployment problem in New Zealand. We talked to a lot of people who would like to leave or were planning to leave or who had left. There's more of a social safety network in New Zealand than in most Western countries. And it's expensive, and a lot of the political debate has to do with how can we afford the tax levels that it takes to have the programs that are popular, not unlike the United States, and we don't have a strong economy.
But there were no slums in the sense, there's much more evenly distributed wealth, which is probably upper blue class,
upper blue
collar class that. Is a mixed message. It's comforting to see that everybody is reasonably well cared for, but it does not yet solve that unemployment issue.
I know on our program next week we're going to have your two sons, and we're going to talk about New Guinea, and you have some things that you will show our audience and crafts and so forth. But Judy, you mentioned a little earlier on this program that you appreciate the fact that the arts and the crafts and so forth were gaining. For those of our viewers who may be intrigued to go after this discussion to that part of the world, what can you tell them and inform them that they should see or in the arts and the humanities?
Oh my goodness. We, in New Zealand and Australia both, I was quite struck by the efforts by the governments to in fact provide places for tourists to come and see demonstrations of the arts. In New Zealand, the government is helping fund, and now the Maori group is earning money by selling their crafts and has a demonstration in a museum, that sort of thing, that I thought again gave authenticity and affirmation to these folks that what you do has value. And things are expensive. If it's really a crafted piece, it's taken a great deal of wood carving time or weaving time, sort of thing. In Australia, obviously everyone has thought about the Opera House in the city of Sydney, where we were visiting. We did attend a performance there, and it is an experience to view the sculpture of the Opera House. In addition to that, the Aboriginal art I mentioned is, well, happens to be appealing to me, is much more readily available. To actually participate in any Aboriginal cultural traditions and dances and things, you need to probably arrange through a tour sort of thing. But that is probably the best way to actually see, taste the foods, handle some of the tools, or see some of the crafts that they're doing. Much of that is available through the same northern town of Cairns that we mentioned before. Cairns is spelled C-A-I-R-N-E-S. And so when I looked for it on the map, it took me a long time to find it the first time I saw it, and then I thought, what is the travel agent saying when she says Cairns? But there are some festivals done outside that area that you can visit. We did not have time to attend as many as I would like, but that would be a way to really sense, I think, as much of the history as yet collected.
We're almost out of time, but I just wanted to also find out, for those who are particularly interested in the arts, is there one time of the year that's better to go, that there's more available than another? I'm thinking of things like the Live Theater and also the festivals.
Oh my goodness, Sydney has 5 different performing sections. Wonderful music. The Sydney Opera is there and has been a very successful year-round operation, and one of the few countries and cities where opera is year-round with quite an extensive collection.
Sydney and Melbourne are both very cosmopolitan places, Tony. The Opera House in Sydney is just a spectacular place. I've never seen anything like it. It's an architectural wonder. Just
in terms of seasons, I don't know that there are any different things, different places, and I bet our seasons
we're out of time.
out.
But the good news for our audience is that we'll be back next week, and we'll talk about New Guinea, and we'll have your sons here at that time, and Mary Reed and I will continue that question. We thank you and look forward to the next interview. Ladies and gentlemen, we hope you've enjoyed our program, particularly on Australia and New Zealand. Please join us next week when we talk about New Guinea with our guest. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by an NIC student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.